everyone, and really special thanks to AMLD for inviting me to speak today. I really been looking forward to this talk. Also must commend previous speakers for exciting talks. It's really nice to see the new applications of machine learning and also new sources of data, particularly with the implementation to environmental issues, which my background is from. So by background, I'm working on sustainable finance, energy transition from social science economic perspective at the moment based at Oxford. Prior to this, I was based in Paris. As a brief background, I've been working a lot in my role at the OECD with developing countries, also including African economies on different policy aspects relating to climate change and also green development finance. And even before that, I was based actually for a couple of years in Namibia, advising a Minister of Industrialization there on economic policy concerning some areas in his portfolio. So the focus of this year's conference on Africa is really close to my expertise and also heart. In my work, I do use a lot of machine learning based techniques to uncover those novel insights from the data sets we have to try to tell new narratives and new stories, solve new problems that potentially maybe conventional linear models are not that well suited to do or have challenges. So in today's presentation, I will take you through some findings of a study that I published together with my colleagues recently in Nature Energy. The study focuses on predicting the capacity mix, the generation capacity mix in Africa by the end of this decade that just started. We are trying to predict the success chances of currently planned power plants to be realized over this decade. So I will take you through in this presentation some of the design of the study, the data set we used and the model we built, and then dwell in some detail on the results and the implications for the general debate on Africa's potential to transition fast to renewables, or maybe not so fast, we'll see. So where did we start when we started building the model? We accessed a large data set that included detailed information on power plants, not only implemented, so the installed capacity, but also the projects that failed or the projects that are currently being planned. So it's a large data set that covers 54 African countries, contains information on over 6,500 power plants. And we complemented these data with some socioeconomic governance indicators by country to see really which features matter most when it comes to predicting the realization chances of a planned power plant. Because, you know, from experience, we know that just the fact that the power plant is planned doesn't immediately mean that it will be actually successfully implemented. This is an area that is often overlooked in the literature and in general in the energy transition debate. But it's an important aspect, and this is what we find actually. Power plants are far from having equal chances or full 100% probabilities of being implemented. So we used that data set of historical projects, both successful and failed, and coupled with some country level variables to predict on the pipeline as we know it at the moment or at the point when we conducted the study, what the probability is of the currently planned project being successfully implemented. And then we were able to arrive at a certain capacity mix that is likely to be achieved across African continents in 2030. So here is a snapshot of some of the strengths of the model that we considered important for the data and also the problem that we solved. So we used the gradient boosted tree model, LightGBM algorithm by Microsoft. And I'm sure the machine learning community here is well familiar with the advantages of this type of predictive models compared to, say, conventional econometric models. But it's worth highlighting some that were potentially important for us. In general, data on developing countries is often fraught with, some complicated implications, missing values, for example. So having model that it wouldn't be biased by some missing values, for example, is quite useful. Second, what we found useful is, of course, this ability to capture nonlinear relationships, because obviously in the actual reality, things don't often work along a linear line. And then, of course, also the possibility of interpreting this model. So not just having it as a black box, but actually we use trap values to understand which features contributed most to prediction. And then we could also interpret the results in a more informative way also for decision makers. On the right side, I have some points on the steps basically that is necessary to undertake, even when one takes, a model just out of the box or off the shelf. One would still need to properly train it, validate it to make sure that it performs well, not only in sample, but out of sample. So here are some results. Those are the mean absolute impact of individual feature on the prediction on the past data on the training set. So what we can see immediately is that the green features actually relating to project characteristics are by far more salient than the country level variables. And that's actually good news because, well, arguably it's easier to tweak the project characteristics than, say, improve the corruption level or in general achieve a high economic development level in a country. So what we saw is that, for example, the capacity of a project, its technology, for example, being renewable energy or fossil fuels, the participation of development finance institutions in a project or a project being either on-grid or off-grid, and also the ownership of a planned power plant, or in this case, on the training set, past historical power plant, all are really important. They're all in top those features by the importance for the prediction. So for example, we find that renewable energy projects overall historically have had lower chances of success than fossil fuel projects such as gas. And that's quite an interesting finding in this regard. So what we arrived at when we applied this learning to the project pipeline that I mentioned, we were able to calculate the capacity mix that would be likely achieved across the African continent in 2030, of course, taking into account also some of the currently operating capacity that will still be in operation by then, minus obviously something, the capacity that is likely to be retired. So what we see here in this last stacked bar is that while the capacity overall more than doubles, so that's good news in terms of meeting growing energy demand across African economies, when we look at really the composition of that capacity mix, we see that non-hydro renewables, so say solar or wind, they still account for quite a limited share in the overall generation, in the overall capacity mix. So they are of much more importance than, say, in 2019 when we conducted the study in the first bar in the graph. But still, it's quite limited. If you look at, for example, compared to hydropower, that still has quite a high presence, although as a caveat, we did find that actually hydropower projects have high failure rates, but just a mere volume of those projects and the size of those projects means that they still account for quite a high share in the capacity mix. That's also interesting consideration from physical climate change risks, because obviously some of those countries that we've looked at are fraught, like they're experiencing, for example, droughts as a physical consequence of climate change, and that also adds another layer of uncertainty on actually implementation of hydropower projects and whether they will be able to operate at their full capacity during their lifetime. And of course, again, what we see here in terms of fossil fuel capacity, we see that gas seems to still dominate, and the dominance of gas particularly prominent for some regions, for example, North Africa. So where does it all fit in terms of current literature in general that looks at the energy transition, energy planning, climate models. So traditional climate models, they tend to project how the future might look like given a certain number of assumptions. And that's great because they offer a wide spectrum of potential futures and are able to inform decision makers about potential risks involved in how one or the other future will unravel. What we did here with our model is to predict rather than project, predict where across this wide spectrum of futures projected for Africa, the continent might be most realistically heading to, given the current composition of its project pipeline and the estimated success chances of those power plants. So what the literature in general says is that, I'm coming back to the title of my presentation, is that Africa in general has the capacity, has the potential to leapfrog, to transition fast to renewable energy this decade in the coming years. Given the falling technology prices, but also abundance of the continent in renewable energy resources, coupled with the need to bridge this electricity access gap and meet the growing energy demand. But what we see with this graph is really that it is unlikely, given how the current situation looks like in terms of data on planned power plants and their success. So here are a couple of takeaways that you might want to retain. First is that not all power plants, as I said, have equal chances of being implemented, and those chances are far from 100% probability. Renewable energy projects, particularly including hydropower, actually have lower chances of success. So that presents one lever of changing the situation should African countries decide to close this energy demand gap through renewables rather than depending on fossil fuels. But of course, in the end, it's completely up to them to decide their future. Second is this fact that project characteristics matter quite a bit for project success chance. And finally, what our study really shows is that in general, the composition of the project pipeline should be tweaked towards renewables, again, should African countries choose to transition and live up to their potential to leapfrog to low carbon generation. Thank you. Really look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Galina. Very interesting talk, and I would say a rather grim prediction that you have here. We don't have questions yet in the chat, so please feel free to ask questions. My first question is, given the grim prediction that you make, have you had the chance to present your work to policymakers? Also, maybe given your former affiliations with the OECD.
Yeah, we've started disseminating our work. It's been actually picked up quite a bit by media, and also this is what we expect, that it might inform decision makers as well through the coverage that it received by media. And that's really ongoing debate. We are planning to continue the outreach. I've written a blog post for OECD Development Center as well to really feed into this debate on how best facilitate or in general on the barriers to Africa's low carbon transition. So that's definitely work in progress, and we try to dedicate quite a bit of time to disseminating and ensuring an impact of our work. Because obviously for academics, that's one thing to publish, but another thing is actually ensure real world impact.
Yes, that's a very important point. That's true. We have two questions from Wasim. The first one is, according to you, what role will have the public sector? And related to that, what role will have global energy companies in the shift to renewable energies on the African continent?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, we are looking at the role of government through the ownership feature, for example, in our model. So we see that state ownership doesn't necessarily impede the implementation chances of project. Actually, it might support. So we see that state-owned projects have fared quite well in terms of their success chances compared to, for example, IPP-owned project. There's a lot of this talk, and well, the data shows that IPPs actually are driving the energy transition overall in the world, adding renewables to the generation mix. With government-owned companies like utilities might be lagging behind. That's a topic of my other work. But what we see here is that in recent years, there's an indication of learning curve effects in the sense that the success chances of IPP-owned projects have been improving recently, meaning that there is a learning by doing kind of effect at play, that they are becoming increasingly more competitive. So it's really important for a specific project at hand to really strike that ownership right, because what we also see in terms of PPPs, public-private partnerships, those projects actually have quite low implementation chances. Another role for public sector is through international finance, through the development finance. As I said, we see that the participation of the DFIs in project financing has a clear positive effect on implementation chances. So here it's really important to unlock those learning curve effects by supporting financing, de-risking the projects that otherwise wouldn't potentially be undertaken, and obviously the learning wouldn't have happened otherwise. So those are, for example, wind projects. So we see that solar plants have also had this learning curve effect recently coming through. So they have been improving in their success chances, while we can't see that for wind. So that's quite important role of government, both in Africa but also in other countries, in channeling the finance towards those projects. And of course, energy companies, that's a combination, of small actors, for example, that are agile and could enter the market quickly, like IPPs, and really drive that transition through, for example, small scalable projects, because again, we see that the size of a project has an inverse relationship to its implementation. So the bigger the project, the higher failure risks. So in that respect, there is really potential for both synergies of public sector and private sector in driving that transition.
Thank you for this extensive and very interesting answer. There is another question from Moritz in the chat, and let me read that out. So he says, I hope that Africa would skip the power plant and grid stage and go straight to decentralized renewable energy, like it did with telecommunications. What's hindering there?
So decentralized, that's basically off-grid, right? Off-grid power plants. And I think the solution, well, what we see in general now is that Africa indeed is making quite a bit of use of decentralized solutions. And that's a way forward for electrifying, for example, some rural, faraway communities that are located just quite far away from the grid. I experienced that myself in Namibia, a vast country with vast territory, but yet quite small population. But of course, when we talk in terms of industrial, in terms of electrifying industrial, use or economy for the industry, it's important to also make sure that the shift is happening also for grid connected plants, because obviously small power plants off grids, they won't be able to meet the whole energy demand of the continent. So it's important to, of course, to find solution that would fit best an economic activity that you would like to power through this type of electricity.
I see, thank you. And maybe one last question on my side. So you made an important point, I think, when you said that you were not using black box models and rather using interpretable models. And this is indeed very important when you're doing econometrics and policy making. And that was something that was also central in my own research. So I was just wondering if you could maybe describe the types of model that you've been using to make your predictions.
Sure. So as I quickly mentioned, it was a light GBM algorithm by Microsoft. It's a gradient boosted tree model. And what we did is to use sharp values. I'm not sure if the community here is familiar with that, but that's a concept or like methods to interpret machine learning models that has emerged, I think, in 2018 when Lundberg published on this. Actually, is working, I think, now for Microsoft. Really brilliant work, and it's more and more used now. So what sharp values really do is that they show the importance of a specific feature in affecting the prediction in one or the other way. So one could plot with the help of sharp values the effect of each variable, of each feature on the prediction, and see really whether it's moving to the in the positive or negative zone. So to which extent it affects this prediction, and that has considerably, demystified machine learning models for practitioners who might be otherwise quite suspicious. Again, coming to this, allegation that those models are black box and you just get a prediction out of it, rather than actually being able to interpret. Because obviously in econometrics you have the specific variables and you're looking at that in detail. So this kind of addition to the models in terms of their interpretability is really helpful to also improve their uptake by practitioners in the field.